Welcome to our 100th birthday celebration. Our chapter was instituted on the evening of October 5th, 1916, 1 year after the tragic death of Nurse Edith Cavell, from whom we take our chapter name. Edith Cavell died as a pioneering nurse 101 years ago, executed by the German army on the 12th of October 1915 for helping British soldiers get home from Belgium. Her death became notorious across the world, and she was celebrated as a martyr for freedom. Her death made a big impact in Britain, its empire, and the wider world, with memorials in London, Norwich, Melbourne, and Brussels. And she even had a mountain named after her right here in Alberta, Mount Edith Cavell in Jasper National Park. Now we'll move on to look at some of the facts and milestones from when our chapter was first born. Our first worthy matron, Elizabeth Bawn, and worthy patron, Alex McDougall, took office for the first 2 years of our chapter's life. 7 petitions for initiation and 1 petition for affiliation were read during that first year. Our rent was only $22, and our first year fundraising amounted to just over $500. It was 1916, and the world was at war. One of the bloodiest offenses of the war was the Battle of Somme, fought by the armies of the British and French empires against the German Empire. It began July 1st, 1916, and although it was never expected to be such a long offensive, it lasted until November 18 of that year. British troops went over the top on July 1st, and in that first day alone, the British Army had 57,470 casualties. Our worthy matron's own great-grandfather died on that first day at the Somme. During the 4-month battle, the Allied troops lost over 600,000 men, including many Canadians. After the horrors of the First World War, the return to normalcy was a relief for not only the direct participants of the conflict, but also those who had maintained affairs on the home front. The 20s were a time of prosperity for most, and fast growth in industry, manufacturing, and the cities. Immigration filled up the empty spaces of the prairies and kept the railways busy, while the lumber and fisheries industries boomed. Automobiles were replacing horses and carriages, and broadcast radio made its appearance. The United States brought in prohibition, and smuggling alcohol across the border became an industry which created fortunes for many. Happy days were here again, and the people enjoyed the good times, believing that they would not end. In Edith Cavell, during our first decade, we read 225 petitions for initiation or affiliation. Not everyone was approved, and by the end of the decade, our membership stood at 185. The chapter had 2 business meetings each month, including the summer months, and meetings generally ended around 11:30 p.m. Common fundraisers included card parties and dances, and often the card parties were held after the close of the meetings. In 1924, the chapter ordered a rug from Scotland for $195.35. This same rug is still in use today. Also that year, a motion was made to designate the first Tuesday of the month as a business meeting and the third Tuesday as a special meeting, which is also still in effect. In January of 1927, we installed Florence Johnston as worthy matron and H.J. Bawn as worthy patron. There were 300 present at this installation. Dues were raised by $1 from $3 to $4 to cover refreshments. Donuts were popular back then, and they were $3.20 for 8 dozen. Initiation fees were raised to $10, and the secretary's honorarium was raised to $50. In 1931, it was raised again to $100. In November 1927, the Holland Tunnel under the Hudson River opens, linking New York City with New Jersey. Charles Lindbergh flies the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic non-stop and solo, direct from New York City to Paris, the first solo transatlantic flight, and Leon Trotsky is expelled from the Communist Party, and Joseph Stalin takes control. Our rent to Oddfellows Temple was $18, and our membership was $201. In 1928, the cartoon star Mickey Mouse appears in Steamboat Willie, an animated short film produced by Walt Disney. Our rent was $20. We had $822.85 in our bank account. We gave notice to the Oddfellows Hall of our intent to vacate, and by the end of 1928, we were 218 strong. In January of 1929, Edith Cavell met for the first time at the Masonic Temple on 12th Avenue. Our rent was $25. This would be our home for the next 30 years. Also this year, our chapter completely furnished one of the rooms at the Woods Christian Home, and they dedicated the room to the memory of Edith Cavell. This room was sponsored and maintained by the chapter for the next 33 years. In 1929 came the Great Wall Street Crash, which started the period of the Great Depression in the United States, starting a worldwide economic crisis and lasting until the mid-30s. Rose Tucker was our worthy matron, and D. Fred Christie was the worthy patron. This year saw the establishment of a joint sick committee, which had made over 60 visits by December of 1930. In 1933, the chapter was presented with a Union Jack flag. The 1930s saw Al Capone imprisoned for tax evasion. The Empire State Building was completed, air conditioning was invented, and Amelia Earhart was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1932. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1953. The Loch Ness Monster was first spotted. Bonnie and Clyde were killed by police, and the cheeseburger was invented in 1934. Ma Barker and her son were killed in a police shootout, and Monopoly was first released. In 1936, all German boys had to join the Hitler Youth. King Edward VIII abdicated the throne of Britain to marry Mrs. Simpson, and in 1937, Amelia Earhart vanished, and the Golden Gate Bridge was opened. As we closed out this decade, Anna A. Bradley was worthy matron, and James T. Burns, worthy patron. A tea and sale of work made a profit of $229. We had fallen to 164 members, and we had $323.13 in the bank. In 1938, Hitler marched his army into Austria, and by 1939, the world was at war once again. Lavella Fraser was our worthy matron, and James T. Burns was our worthy patron. For several years during the war period, we did not have an associate patron in the chapter. The war obviously had an impact on our membership, as well as the activities the members were involved in. We became very involved in supporting the war effort. While Hitler was marching his army through Europe, we were sending comfort parcels to soldiers overseas. We also supported the fundraising efforts of the Grand Chapter to pay for a Red Cross war ambulance. We made quilts for Blitz victims called Bundles for Britain, and fundraised for aid to Russia and the Queen's Canadian Fund. 1941 saw a motion in our chapter to allow members to knit during meetings, presumably to help the war effort. However, this motion was defeated. It was also raised at Grand Chapter that year, and was again defeated. 1941 also saw the passing of past Grand Matron Alex Darlow, who was a member of Edith Cavell and was worthy Grand Matron in 1922. In addition to the war efforts, we continued to support the Woods homes. And in 1944, the chapter formed a young people's group, and they adopted a little girl at the Woods Christian Homes to provide for her needs. The chapter supported this girl, Gracie, until she left home. 1944 saw Laura Leadbeater as our worthy matron, and Fred M. Davies as worthy patron. Life membership had been removed in 1934, but in 1945 it was reinstated, with the added restrictions that it required a notice of motion, vote by secret ballot, and a 3/4 majority vote. With the end of World War II, Canadian soldiers returned home to an uncertain future, with their war brides soon to follow. A strong economy and government programs ensured a smooth transition to peacetime. Canadian immigration policy after the Second World War dropped its earlier emphasis on farmers and encouraged skilled laborers who could help build an advanced industrial economy to come to Canada. The experience of the Great Depression influenced post-war planning among most industrialized countries. The Cold War rapidly followed the Second World War as the Soviet Union sought security in Europe and expanded influence, particularly in the former colonies of European nations. In 1951, Rain B. Hayes was worthy matron, and Norman A. Keir was worthy patron. This year saw the chapter continue its donations to the Woods Christian Homes, donating blankets and sheets. We also purchased our Star Point lamps, an electric signet. The signet was dedicated in 1953. In 1954, the chapter was presented with a framed picture of the grave of Edith Cavell. In 1956, an Edith Cavell medallion was presented to the chapter to be worn by all worthy matrons. The following year, the chapter was presented with our Eastern Star flag, and in 1958, we were presented with an altar, kneeling pads, and 5 Star Point pedestals. Our history books don't tell us who exactly presented us with this paraphernalia, but it is still in use today. The 1950s saw the first modern credit card, the first organ transplant, and the start of the Korean War. Color TV was first introduced, and Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain again. 1952 saw the introduction of seatbelts, the discovery of the polio vaccine, and Princess Elizabeth became Queen at the age of 25. The 50s saw the first Playboy magazine in print. Hillary and Norgay climbed Mount Everest, and Stalin died. Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile. The Vietnam War began, and a report tells us that cigarettes cause cancer. In 1955, Margaret Sackville was our worthy matron, and George H. Swan was our worthy patron. Disneyland opened, and James Dean died in a car accident. The following year, Elvis made his gyrating debut on The Ed Sullivan Show, and young women everywhere were swooning. The TV remote control was invented, and the Suez Crisis began, and Dr. Seuss published The Cat in the Hat.